For millennia, the Grand Pyramids of Egypt have towered over the desert sands. Everything about the great ancient civilization that once seized the lands remained a mystery. That is, until July 19th, 1799. A French soldier discovers a large stone about 35 miles east of Alexandria during Napoleon Bonaparte's Egyptian expedition, unearthing a written language that had been dead for thousands of years. The translations would prove to be the key to unlocking the secrets of an entire civilization. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. That's what Herodotus, the father of history, said. Since the Nile is the lifeline, as it provided Egypt with water for the cultivation of crops, which led to the burgeoning of civilization all along the length of the Nile Valley. The river strip that divided the Egyptian territory into two parts provided a favorable environment for the rise of civilization when the Nile Valley began in the Miocene times, cutting it into its current shape. The various geographical resources effectively contributed to the state's foundation. As a result of the annual floods that spread the fertile soil to the east and west over the centuries, mud deposits built up. When the water recedes and flows along its banks, the agricultural year begins, making Egypt one of the first agricultural communities that ever existed in human history. At the end of the Paleolithic era, there was a widespread production of arrows, harpoons, querns, sewed skins, boneworks, and pottery. Carbon-14 tests, on the other hand, were used by researchers to demonstrate that corn was harvested in a Neolithic silo on the edge of Fayum between 4600 and 4250 BC. Later, people built shacks and huts out of reeds and solid mud and sowed corn on the muddy soil of the Nile marshes. Ancient Egypt was divided into two territories, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt lay to the north, where the Nile extended out with its several branches to form the Nile Delta. Upper Egypt, which stretched to Aswan, was to the south. The two kingdoms were united around 3000 BC by King Narmer, but each retained its regalia, the Hedjet or white crown for Upper Egypt, and the Deshret or red crown for Lower Egypt. As a result, the pharaohs were known as the rulers of the two lands, and they wore the Shent, a double crown with each half denoting sovereignty of a different land. The pre-dynastic period in ancient Egypt is the period preceding documented history, encompassing around 6000 to 3150 BCE from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic age, and on to the founding of the First Dynasty. While there are no written records from this period, archaeological digs in Egypt have unearthed items that convey their tale of the Nile River Valley's cultural history. The pre-dynastic period is called by the regions or ancient city sites where these artifacts were discovered, rather than the cultures that lived there. The Halfen culture thrived circa 30,000 BCE in the area between Egypt and Nubia, giving birth to the Cadon and Sibyllian cultures around 10,000 BCE, and the Hierophant culture. All of these cultures are hunter-gatherer societies that gradually grew more sedentary and settled into more permanent settlements based on agriculture. The Fayum Oasis is a natural basin located southeast of the Giza Plateau that gave home to the Fayum A civilization during 9000 to 6000 BCE. These people lived in the vicinity of a vast lake and made their living through agriculture, hunting, and fishing. The people of Fayum constructed reed homes with subterranean basements for food storage. Cattle, sheep, and goats were domesticated, and basketry and pottery production flourished. During this period, tribal chieftains assumed positions of power, which may have been passed down to the next generation in a family or tribal unit. Communities went from tiny tribes traveling together to large groupings of diverse tribes living in the same region all the time. The Fayum A culture gave rise to the Merimde during 5000 to 4000 BCE, which was named from artifacts discovered at the location of that name on the western side of the Nile Delta. The majority of Egyptians were farmers, and agriculture was the basis of the dynastic Egypt economy, and farmers relied on the annual summer floods to grow their crops. We know that the first Egyptian farmers were hunter-gatherers. They planted crops such as wheat, lentils, barley, flax, and peas, in addition to herding animals. According to what was found on a location in the western side of the Nile Delta, the oldest levels of Merimdi Beni Salama that evolved between 8000 and 4000 BC, in addition to the Fayum Basin, both dating back to the Neolithic era. The Nile Valley's convex terrain encouraged the development of several basins, which in ancient times were flooded with floodwaters every year that brought silt and mud that fertilized the soil. These basins, of which 130 have been found, served as the irrigation system's reservoirs in ancient Egypt. Granaries were made of clay jars or baskets that were buried up to their necks in the earth. The El Omari culture, about 4000 BCE, developed on these achievements by building circular homes of higher complexity with plastered mud walls. All of these cultures evolved and flourished in Lower Egypt, Northern Egypt, closest to the Mediterranean Sea, whereas Upper Egypt civilization formed later. The inhabitants of the Badarian culture lived in movable tents, like their ancient forefathers, but preferred fixed homes. Following the Badarian period came the Amratian period, also known as Naqada I, which constructed more complex homes with windows and hearths, wattle and daub walls, and windbreaks around the main entryway. The practice of mummification began around 3500 BCE, where burial items were still left with the deceased. These developments were aided by the Girzian culture, also known as Naqada II, 3500 to 3200 BCE, which launched trading with other regions, inspiring changes in culture and art. The houses were built of sun-baked brick, and the more opulent ones included courtyards, an addition that would become commonplace in Egyptian homes later. The city of Abydos, located north of Naqada, became an important burial location, and huge tombs were built, forming a necropolis, a city of the dead. These tombs were originally made of mud bricks, but subsequently of huge, neatly hewn limestone. Eventually, the site would become the burial place for Egypt's rulers. Despite this, evidence reveals that individuals from all across the nation had their deceased buried at Abydos, and gave burial gifts to commemorate their memory. By this time, the cities of Zeus and Hierakonpolis were considered ancient, while Thinis, Naqada, and Nekhen were rapidly developing. The hieroglyphic alphabet, which was invented around 3400 to 3200 BCE, was used for maintaining records, although no entire sentences from this period have been discovered. At this time, the earliest Egyptian writing discovered so far originates from Abydos, and was discovered on pottery, clay seal imprints, and bone and ivory items. Complete sentences are not found in Egypt until the time of King Peribsen in the Second Dynasty 500 years later. This period led to the Naqada III period from 3200 to 3150 BCE. Following Naqada III, the early dynastic period and Egypt's recorded history began. With commerce, communities expanded and flourished, and the populations of both Lower and Upper Egypt increased. Small villages of brick dwellings and buildings evolved into bigger urban centers that soon clashed, most likely for trade products and water resources. Thinis, Naqada, and Nekhen were the three principal city-states of Upper Egypt during the period. Thinis appears to have defeated Naqada before absorbing Nekhen. These battles were fought between the Scorpion Kings, whose identity is unknown, and others, most likely Ka and Narmer. According to some researchers, Scorpion I, Scorpion II, and Ka were the final three rulers of the proto-dynastic period, before King Narmer invaded and unified Lower and Upper Egypt and created the First Dynasty. The early dynastic period in Egypt began in the years 3150 to 2613 BCE. This marks the beginning of the country's historical era in which Upper Egypt, the south, and Lower Egypt to the north were unified as one country under centralized authority. During this time, the divine rule of the monarch started, and a distinct Egyptian culture emerged, including the development of writing, arts, and sciences. Menes, the first king of Egypt, was a ruler of Upper Egypt, presumably from Thinis or Hierakonpolis, who defeated the other city-states around him before conquering Lower Egypt around 3150 BCE. Narmer married the princess Neithotep of Naqada in an arrangement to enhance the links between the two towns. He undertook military operations in Lower Egypt to quell revolts and expand his territory into Canaan and Nubia. He sponsored massive construction projects, and urbanization developed throughout his reign. Hor-Aha, Narmer's son, is assumed to have succeeded him in 3100 BCE, continuing his father's military expansion and increasing trade. He was notably interested in religion and the concept of the afterlife, and it was under his reign that the Mastaba tomb was built. Hor-Aha was replaced by his son Jur in 3050 BCE, who followed in his father's footsteps. His son Jet, about 3000 BCE, married Princess Mernith and is considered to have taken leadership of the nation after his death. It is uncertain whether she governed as regent for her infant son Den or as queen, but her reign is notable for being the first time a woman is recorded governing in ancient Egypt. Den, about 2990 BCE, is regarded as the greatest monarch of the First Dynasty and reigned for 50 years. His reputation as an efficient monarch stemmed from his economic advances, military conquests, and the stability of his rule, as proven by expensive construction projects and elaborate works of art. Den is the first monarch to be represented wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, showing that he ruled over a unified nation. Den was succeeded by two additional monarchs, Anegib and later Semerkhet, both of whom had tough reigns marked by insurgency. The dynasty ended with the Ka's reign, during which his heirs struggled for the throne and were defeated by Hotep Sekemui, who established the Second Dynasty. Internal strife and a lack of, or misunderstanding over, records ruined the Second Dynasty, 2890 to 2670 BCE. None of the Second Dynasty monarchs have reliable dates, and several of the kings' names appear to be repeats of earlier rulers. Hotep Sekemui, which means two powerful ones at peace, is a prime illustration of this issue. Because of his name, it would seem that he came to power after subduing the princes who fought for the throne after Kwa. But his name is inscribed on the entrance to Kwa's tomb, implying that he was the ruler responsible for burying Kwa, and he already had that name before the succession war broke out. Hotep Sekemui is credited with bringing peace to Egypt upon his ascension to the throne, although a brief one. Instability and rebellion marked his reign. Raneb, also known as Nibra, was the first to link his name to that of the gods, and so create a bond between the monarch and the divine. There is no reasonable explanation for Peribsen's decision. Early academics claimed he was the first monotheist who declared Set to be the sole deity, but evidence of his reign's devotion to various gods disproved this. Because his name is only found in Upper Egypt, it's possible that he opted to ally with Set for political reasons, to distinguish himself from the Horus religion of Lower Egypt. For whatever reason, he is regarded as a good monarch because commerce, the economy, religious practice, and the arts all thrived during his reign. Peribsen was replaced by Keskemui, probably his son, who continued his predecessor's construction projects and is believed to have brought Egypt's two regions back under central control, or at least reinforced unification. His most famous works include the statues at Hierakonpolis and Abydos, as well as his role as the father of Pharaoh Djoser. The Egyptian Third Dynasty starts with King Djoser, best known for his step pyramid at Saqqara. Manetho's timeline is hazy on who Sennacht was when he governed in the Third Dynasty, and even his name. Sennacht's name is only known from the Abydos monarch list, the Turin Papyrus, and two reliefs discovered in the Mastaba tomb, number K2 at Beit Kalath. Djoser erected so many monuments that historians have long assumed his tenure extended at least 20 years. He started military campaigns to Sinai and kept Egyptian unity, resulting in the stability required for his construction projects and the growth of the arts. Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara is Egypt's first recognized pyramid, which was designed by his architect and vizier, Imhotep. Imhotep was a vizier, sage, architect, astrologer, and chief minister under Djoser, the second pharaoh of Egypt's Third Dynasty, who was later deified and worshipped as the god of medicine in Egypt and Greece, where he was associated with the Greek deity of medicine, Asclepius. He is thought to have designed the step pyramid in Memphis's Saqqara necropolis. This pyramid, which has 6 steps, is the world's oldest surviving stone monument. An inscription carrying his name on a statue of Djoser uncovered near the Saqqara pyramid site attests to Imhotep's high status in Djoser's court. The inscription includes titles such as the leader of the sculptures and the chief of the seers. Historical documents depicting Egyptian society and medicine throughout the Old Kingdom demonstrate that the main magician of the pharaoh's court frequently functioned as the nation's chief physician. The step pyramid started as a basic mastaba monument with a flat top and sloping sides, similar to many previous dynasties' tombs. The architect, Imhotep, on the other hand, had bigger plans for his king's eternal dwelling. The step pyramid is a succession of mastabas piled on top of each other, each step slightly smaller than the one beneath, to create a pyramid shape. Earlier mastabas were made of clay bricks, but the step pyramid was made of stone slabs with carved motifs of trees and reeds on them. When finished, the step pyramid stood 62 meters tall. making it the tallest building of its period. To deter robbers and secure the king's corpse and burial goods, the real chambers of the tomb were dug beneath the foundation, as a maze of passageways with rooms off the hallways. However, this strategy did not work because the tomb was robbed of all of its valuables, including the king's corpse. In antiquity, only his foot was discovered in the tomb. Nonetheless, the Step Pyramid's design and building epitomize the genius and vision of the Third Dynasty builders, who would later raise the Buried Pyramid and the Layer Pyramid, among many other structures and sanctuaries. These early visionaries established the foundations for the later True Pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty, which have mesmerized and captivated people for millennia. The Old Kingdom of Egypt is also known as the Age of the Pyramids or the Age of the Pyramid Builders, because it contains the Great Fourth Dynasty, during which King Sneferu mastered the craft of pyramid construction, and the pyramids of Giza were built under the reigns of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Historical documents of this time, the 4th to 6th dynasties of Egypt, are sparse, and historians consider the history of the era as literally written in stone, and mainly architectural in that academics have been able to build a history through the statues and their inscriptions. The pyramids themselves provide little information about their architects, but adjacent funerary shrines and stelae provide the king's names and other significant information. In addition, carvings in stone discovered elsewhere during the period document different events and the dates on which they happened. Lastly, the mausoleum of the 5th dynasty's last monarch, Unas, contained the first pyramid texts, detailed drawings and writings inside the tomb that cast light on the religious views of the period. During the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the elite standardized art, and figures were produced uniformly to reflect the tastes of Memphis, the capital. Although other art forms such as painting and literature exhibit more skill in the Old Kingdom, statues from the late Early Dynastic and Early Old Kingdom periods are very comparable. The Old Kingdom's most famous works of art are the Pyramids of Giza and the Great Sphinx of Giza, both of which remain today, although smaller structures were crafted with the same precision and beauty. In reality, Egyptians placed great importance on Old Kingdom art and architecture in later ages. Although all levels of society may have shared the same religious systems, social inequality persisted even after death. The only significant impediment to reaching an afterlife was being buried outside of Egypt. Egyptians thought that, to be reborn, they needed to be buried in Egypt. If they died abroad, their relatives went to tremendous pains to bring their bodies back for burial, so those correct funerary rituals could be performed and they could be buried in their native land, allowing them to enter the afterlife. To coordinate the labor force that constructed the pyramids at Giza and elsewhere during this time, unprecedented bureaucratic efficiency was needed, and this bureaucracy could only function under a powerful central authority. At the top of the pyramid that represented Egyptian society, the monarch stood. He was granted ownership of all of Egypt by the gods, at least in theory. The literate and illiterate classes were divided in the Egyptian social structure. The literate class was the ruling class. They were a small fraction of the population, but they were the main criteria for determining the character of ancient Egyptian society and everything we knew about the civilization. Individuals were frequently more important than the positions they held. As a result, while the king established the scope of bureaucratic power, effective administration was ultimately dependent on the same pool of literal aristocrats without whom the king could not govern. And we'll state some of them as follows. Because an Egyptian king could not personally control every area of society, the role of the vizier was established as early as the early dynastic period. The vizier, who can be assimilated into a form of prime minister, assigned responsibility to other members of the court, sent communications through scribes, and managed the military, regional governors' activities, public works projects, and tax collections, among other things. Huni, the last king of the Third Dynasty, was long thought to have initiated the massive building projects of the Old Kingdom by constructing the Mitam Pyramid. But credit for the Mitam Pyramid goes to Sneferu, the first king of the Fourth Dynasty, who may have been Huni's son by one of his minor queens. Sneferu began the Old Kingdom's golden era, with his most noteworthy achievements being the 2 pyramids constructed for him at Dashur. Sneferu started his work with the pyramid at Mitam, known as the False Pyramid, due to its shape. It resembles a tower more than a pyramid, and its exterior casing is surrounded by a massive mound of gravel. The Pyramid of Mitam was Egypt's first real pyramid, but it did not last. This is because changes were made to Imhotep's initial pyramid design, causing the exterior casing to sit on sand rather than rock, causing it to fall. The Crooked Period and the Red Pyramid are Sneferu's structures at Dashur, or North Pyramid. The bent pyramid gets its name from the fact that it rises at a 55-degree angle and then changes to a 43-degree angle of smaller stones, giving the impression of bending in towards the summit. The workers had finished the base and sides before recognizing that a 55-degree angle was too steep, and changing their plan to conclude the job as best they could. Sneferu appears to have grasped the issue and went on to construct his third pyramid. Sneferu appears to have been a ruler unafraid of loss or sorrow. When the bent pyramid failed to satisfy his standards, he simply began over. The red pyramid, named after the use of reddish limestone in its building, was constructed on a firm foundation for better stability and rose at a 43-degree inclination. The red pyramid, 105 meters tall, was Egypt's first effective real pyramid. It was originally encased in white limestone, as were the other later pyramids, which crumbled away over time and were collected by locals for other construction projects. Following in the footsteps of Djoser's complex at Saqqara, Sneferu had mortuary temples and the other structures built around his pyramids, with priests overseeing day-to-day activities once the Red Pyramid was finished. All of this points to the stability of his rule, which he bequeathed to his son Khufu when he died. The ancient Greek authors referred to Khufu as Cheops, and he's best known for his Great Pyramid at Giza. In their works, the Greeks portrayed him as a tyrant who oppressed the people and compelled them to labor for him against their will. This perception may have been created by the tales contained in the Westcar Papyrus, a compilation of 4 stories written about the kings of the 4th dynasty and found by Henry Westcar in around 1824 CE. The papyrus contains 4 tales recounted by Khufu's sons, including one in which King Khufu summons a sorcerer who claims to be able to reconnect a decapitated head to a body. And some academics read his actions in requesting a demonstration as malicious or careless. During the reign of Khufu, Egypt became even wealthier as a result of his military battles against Nubia and Libya, as well as his lucrative trade deals with cities such as Byblos. He also invested in agricultural innovations to improve the livelihoods of his people. During his reign, the world's first documented dam was constructed in Wadi Jarawi, a mountain range west of modern Helwan. This dam improved water availability for farms and others in the town. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the final of the ancient 7 wonders of the world, and a distinguishing emblem of Egypt. It is situated on the Giza Plateau near the modern city of Cairo, and was constructed over 20 years during the rule of Khufu. Although many hypotheses exist regarding the pyramid's purpose, the most generally acknowledged idea is that it was built as a tomb for the king. However, how it was constructed remains a mystery to this day. Historians continue to dispute the idea of ramps going around the outside of the building to move the blocks into position. These theories persist despite a growing body of evidence proving that the pyramid was constructed by the ancient Egyptians using technical means that were most likely so common to them that they felt no need to document them. Nonetheless, the complexity of the interior passages, shafts, and chambers, as well as the nearby Osiris shaft, encourages the persistence of these fringe theories, as does the mystery of how the pyramid was built at all, and its orientation to cardinal points. A prominent figure during that time, called Hemayunu, was the vizier during the reign of Khufu in the 4th dynasty, and one of the king's relatives. He was in charge of building his Great Pyramid, and keeping an eye over its construction works, and he was buried near Khufu's pyramid. The construction work of the pyramid was done by expert and unskilled laborers employed by the state for the job. These employees either offered to pay off a debt, performed community service, or were paid for their time. The annual inundation of the Nile River was important for Egyptian survival because it distributed rich soil from the riverbank all across the shore's farmlands. However, it also made farming those lands impossible during the flood. During these times, the government supplied work for farms by constructing large monuments. These were the individuals who performed the real, physical labor of moving stones, elevating obelisks, constructing temples, and constructing the pyramids that continue to amaze and motivate people today. A family member outside the legal line called Djedefre after his death. Djedefre was Khufu's son, but he did not appear to be his designated heir. Some scholars believe Djedefre built the Great Sphinx of Giza, while others believe Khafre, his sibling and successor, built it. The Sphinx is the world's biggest monolithic monument, showing a recumbent lion's torso with a king's head and visage. Historically, this king's visage has been identified as Khafre's, but Dobrev and others believe it's Khufu's. It appears to have been constructed by Khafre because it is exactly in line with his pyramid complex, and the Sphinx's face resembles Khafre more than Khufu. Khafre's pyramid is the second largest in Giza, and his complex is almost as big as his father's. Little is known about his rule. According to Egyptian texts, he continued his father's policies and government model by concentrating power in the hands of his closest family members and exerting strict control over policies and laws. Following Khafre's demise, succession was temporarily disrupted again when Baka, Jedefre's son, took the throne. He did not even rule for a year before Menkaure, Khafre's son, took over as monarch. Both the Greeks and the Egyptian writings praise Menkaure. Menkaure, like his father and grandpa before him, started construction on his Giza pyramid and shrine complex. Menkaure's pyramid and complex are smaller than the other two, which represent a significant development in the history of the Old Kingdom, and one of the causes of its collapse. The resources required to construct the Great Pyramid were no longer accessible during Menkaure's period, but he did his best to establish an everlasting residence on par with his father's and grandfather's. Quenra, Menkaure's son and designated successor, perished while this pyramid was being constructed, upsetting the dynastic succession, and Menkaure died before the pyramid complex was finished. Despite reigning for 30 years, he was unable to finish the work of his predecessors, which many historians attribute to the dwindling resources at his disposal. Shepseskaf, Menkaure's successor, finished Menkaure's structure at Giza, but was buried in a relatively modest mastaba at Saqqara. As previously stated, the monarchs diverted immense resources to their funerary structures and buildings, but these temples and sanctuaries were increasingly under the authority of the priests who managed them, rather than the king. Although the Giza Plateau is now an old, sand-swept location on the outskirts of Cairo, it was a city of the deceased, inhabited by the living who tended to it during Menkaure's time. Giza had priests' houses, shrines, worker accommodations, stores, factories, breweries, and all the amenities of a small metropolis. The civilian life in ancient Egypt was very active. The lowest social class consisted of peasant farmers who did not own the land on which they worked on, or the houses in which they resided. The monarch, members of the court, nomarchs, and priests owned the land. To begin the day, peasants would say, "Let us work for the nobility." Peasants were virtually always farmers, regardless of what other trade they practiced. They cultivated and harvested their crops, giving the majority to the landowner while keeping part for themselves. Most had private gardens, which the ladies maintained while the men worked in the fields. The lowest stratum of society created the items utilized in commerce, allowing the civilization as a whole to survive. These peasants were also part of the workforce that erected Egypt's pyramids and other monuments. When the Nile River's banks overflowed, farming became difficult, and the men and women went to work on the king's projects. This labor was always rewarded, and no literary or physical evidence supports the assertion that any of Egypt's major monuments were erected by slave labor. Work building monuments like the pyramid and associated burial complexes, temples, and obelisks provided the peasantry with the sole possibility of upward mobility. Skilled painters and engravers in particular were in high demand in Egypt, and were paid more than unskilled laborers who merely hauled the stones for the construction from one location to another. Peasant farmers might also raise their status by learning a craft and producing the vases, bowls, plates, and other ceramics that people need. Skilled carpenters could make a fortune by making tables, desks, chairs, beds, and storage chests, while painters were needed to decorate upper-class dwellings, castles, tombs, and monuments. Brewers were likewise held in high regard, and breweries were occasionally controlled by women. They appear to have been operated on by females in early Egyptian history. Beer was the most popular beverage in ancient Egypt, and it was commonly utilized as a kind of recompense. 3 times a day, workers on the Giza Plateau were given a beer ration. The deity Osiris was said to have provided the drink to the people, and breweries were overseen by the goddess Tenene. Marriages were more secular than religious in ancient Egypt. The parents planned the majority of weddings in any of the classes. Girls were often married at the age of 12, and boys at the age of 15. Royal offspring were frequently promised to foreign monarchs as babies to seal treaties. The ancient Egyptians' lives were not all labor. They found plenty of time to have fun by participating in sports, board games, and other activities. Hockey, handball, archery, swimming, tug-of-war, gymnastics, rowing, and a sport known as water jousting, which was a sea battle played in small boats on the Nile River in which a jouster tried to knock the other out of his boat, while a second team member maneuvered the craft, were all ancient Egyptian sports. The festivals of ancient Egypt were individually distinct in their own right, depending on the nature of the occasion, but they all had one thing in common: drinking and feasting. The Egyptian diet consisted mostly of grains, wheat, and vegetables. The meat was incredibly expensive, and only royalty could afford it. The 4th dynasty ended with Shepseskaf's brief reign, and the 5th started with much less hope. The 5th dynasty is known as the Sun King's dynasty because so many of their titles contain the name of the deity Ra, usually given as Re. The first three of these rulers, Userkaf, Sahur, and Kakai, would later be memorialized as divinely chosen in the Westkar papyrus tale, The Birth of the Kings. The dynasty starts with King Userkaf, but a lady called Kenkaz, most likely a daughter of Menkar, appears prominently in the Egyptian texts as mother of two kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, though it's unclear who those monarchs were. Her monument is the fourth pyramid at Giza, and she was a significant person. Not much is known about her. Userkaf is best renowned for his work on the Temple of the Sun and Abusir. This structure represents a significant divergence from the position of the monarch at the beginning of the 4th dynasty, and the beginning of the end of Giza as the king's necropolis. The sun deity Ra was now venerated directly by the people through the priesthood, and the king's position as the god's primary representative was reduced. Userkaf's son Sahur replaced him and constructed his funerary complex at Abusir near the Temple of the Sun. Sahur was a capable monarch who led the first Egyptian expedition to Punt and arranged significant trade treaties with other countries. Punt, on the other hand, was one of his biggest accomplishments, as it became an important source of many of Egypt's most valuable resources, and in time was regarded as a legendary country of the gods. Sahur constructed his own temple to the sun in Abusir and was the first to use palmiform columns in the building, which would later become the norm for columns throughout Egypt. Sahur's war exploits and cautious resource management enriched the nation, as demonstrated by the intricate work done on his mortuary complex and the inscriptions discovered. His son, Neferirker Kakai, succeeded him. Inscriptions suggest he was a good king and well-regarded, but little is known of his tenure, except that the priesthood got even more dominant during his control. His son, Neferifre, succeeded him but perished young, possibly around the age of 20. He was followed by King Shepseskar. Nusir-Ini succeeds him, and the priests of Ra acquire even more authority during his rule. The bureaucracy of the temples and mortuary buildings grew as well, putting a burden on royal coffers, which paid for sanctuary care and maintenance. Menkaure-Kaiu replaced him, but little is known about his rule other than the fact that he was the last monarch to construct a temple to the sun. Djedkaraisi replaced him in the late 25th to mid-24th century BC. The roots of Djedkaraisi are unclear. He's not regarded as Menkaure-Kaiu's son, but he may be connected. To keep the economy stable, he reforms the administration and the clergy extensively during his rule. Djedkaraisi refused the customary practice of erecting a shrine to the sun deity and decreased the number of clerics required to maintain funerary structures. He also arranged the second Punt expedition, which enriched Egypt and reinforced relations with Punt. The most important element of Djedkaraisi's reign, however, was the decentralization of the government in Memphis, which gave local authorities more authority. Djedkaraisi was replaced by his son, Unas, the reign of whom is little documented. Unas was the first Egyptian king to have the interior of his tomb decorated and inscribed with what became known as the pyramid texts. These inscriptions depict the king in communion with Ra and Osiris. The position of the king was already considerably reduced when the 6th dynasty started. Local officials and bureaucrats built more elaborate tombs than nobles during the rule of the first monarch, Teti. Teti was killed by his bodyguards according to the 3rd century BCE historian Manetho, an act that would have been inconceivable earlier. He was replaced by Userkure, who may have been involved in the assassination plan. His reign was brief, and he was followed by Merir-Pepi I, during whom the nomarchs gained authority. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the political power had fragmented and the system was decentralized. The restoration of central power was a lengthy process that lasted well into the 12th dynasty. Because of the breakdown of central power, political authority passed into the hands of the nomarchs, who took complete control. This pattern persisted during the reigns of Merenre-Nemtimsaf I and Neferkare-Pepi II, who ascended to the kingdom as a child and perished as an old man, signifying an incredible rule of nearly a century. During Pepi II's lengthy rule, the Old Kingdom gradually crumbled. The increasing influence of provincial nomarchs and the clergy eroded the central government's and king's authority. Pepi II was followed by Merenre-Nemtimsaf II, with a very short reign, and the dynasty ended with Necherkar, who is identified by some scholars and Egyptologists as the Queen Nitocris from Herodotus' account of an Egyptian queen who avenges her brother's murder by drowning his killers at a banquet. Pepi II had outlived any heirs to the throne, and appears to have been a pretty ineffective monarch in his final years. When drought caused famine in the country, there was no effective central authority to react to it. The Old Kingdom terminated with the 6th dynasty because no powerful ruler ascended to the throne to guide the people. Local authorities focused on their areas and lacked the means and motivation to assist the rest of the nation. As the 6th dynasty died out, Egypt gradually descended into the First Intermediate Period. The First Intermediate Period is marked primarily by a rise in the authority of provincial administrators of distinct areas, and a decline in the power of the central government at Memphis. The great structures of the Old Kingdom on the scale of Giza's pyramids were no longer constructed within the First Intermediate Period because there was no strong central sovereign to order and pay for them, and no administration to coordinate the large workforce. The cultural image that comes from a study of historical data does not support a chaotic, dark era, but rather a different social and political model than what had come before. There is some historical evidence for the claim of unrest and claimed disorder, which stems from the absence of a single powerful central government. The country's different regions were essentially self-governing. The dearth of information about the kings of the 7th and 8th dynasties attest to their ineffectiveness. Their identities and dates will be forgotten in Egyptian annals. The ancient city of Memphis was abandoned at some time by rulers who saw themselves as the heirs of the Old Kingdom kings. The rulers of the 9th and 10th dynasties then seized Heracleopolis as their center and declared themselves Egypt's real kings. Intef, a Theban nomarch who bore the customary epithets of Great Overlord, of the Nome, and Overseer of Priests, came to prominence in Thebes around 2125 BC and opposed the authority of Heracleopolitan kings. Intef I established Egypt's 11th dynasty and provided the push for the country's unity. During the Middle Kingdom, he was known as Intef the Mighty, and a monument in his honor was erected in the Temple of Karnak. And this was the way leading to the beginning of a new era, which was the Middle Kingdom. Although Mentuhotep II was known as the Second Menes, who united Egypt and ushered in the Middle Kingdom period, the road to that unity was laid out by Intef I and his successors. Mentuhotep I, approximately 2115 BCE, followed Intef I's path and conquered the neighboring nomes for Thebes, considerably increasing the city's stature and strength. His initiatives were carried on by his predecessors. Mentuhotep II used these early victories to ultimately beat Heracleopolis and then punish those nomes who had stayed faithful to the old kings while rewarding those who had honored Thebes. Mentuhotep II devoted his time after the process of unity to the ruling, military accomplishments, and construction projects. Mentuhotep's successor, Mentuhotep III, reigned during 2010 to 1998 BCE, maintained and expanded his programs. He dispatched an army to Punt and strengthened the northern delta's borders. Mentuhotep IV replaced him. His entire 7-year rule is silent, but he most likely continued his predecessor's policies effectively because the nation is thriving when Amenemhat replaces him as monarch. When Amenemhat was Mentuhotep IV's vizier and was sent with his mission to quarry stones for the king's project, he had an inscription made of the extraordinary events he witnessed. First, a gazelle gave birth on the stone selected for the king's sarcophagus top, indicating that the stone had been chosen correctly because it was endowed with fecundity and life. Second, an unanticipated rainfall descended on the celebration, revealing a well big enough to water the entire gathering. This inscription was later interpreted to mean that Amenemhat was chosen by the gods to become king, as the gods had allowed him to experience miracles. Amenemhat I abandoned Thebes for unknown reasons and established his seat in court in Ititawi, south of Memphis. Amenemhat I's successor, Sennacherib I, 1971 to 1926 BCE, improved the country's infrastructure and initiated the kinds of grand building projects that had characterized the Old Kingdom and represented the king's power, including a temple to Amun at Karnak, which sparked the construction of the Great Temple Complex there. Amenemhat I had followed in the footsteps of Intef II and Mentuhotep II by restricting the authority of local nomarchs and priests, and giving power only to those most trusted in the family. Sennacherib I continued the same strategy. The administration of the 12th dynasty was so effective that, unlike the Old Kingdom, it kept wealth centralized with the monarch while allowing for the development and prosperity of individual regions, without allowing them to become too strong. The king governed all of Egypt.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and I see you next video. Part 2 will continue the history.